Thank you, Paul. Good morning, everybody. So it's great to be back at SVPCA after a hiatus of about 5 years when I spent time in Australia. And I'm going to be talking about Hypsilophodon today, and the talk's going to be slightly less bold than this title. So Hypsilophodon is a small bipedal ornithischian dinosaur from the early Cretaceous of the UK, and lots of really nice materials known from the Isle of Wight. It was one of the first dinosaurs to be discovered and described in great detail. And because of its unusual size, a lot of early discussion focused on whether it was actually an adult species, whether it was a juvenile iguanodon. So the rich history of Hypsilophodon involves lots of different interpretations of its lifestyle. Early on, it was part of the discussion as to whether dinosaurs looked more like lizards or perhaps had a more mammalian or kangaroo-like posture. Marsh's depiction in the 1890s have it as a bipedal cursorial animal with upright posterior limbs. And then in the 30s, Swinton suggested that Hypsilophodon might be arboreal because it had long toes. And this idea persisted at least until the 60s when it was then knocked down. And in the 70s, we can see this depiction that reflects the fact we then thought of Hypsilophodon as a small running animal, often pursued by predators. And there's some armor actually shown here in the back, which has very recently been shown by Richard and Peter Galton to probably be mineralized cartilage associated with the rib cage. And this is a more modern depiction of Hypsilophodon, where it also has like a little beak at the front. So this kind of flavor as a small dinosaur has given Hypsilophodon iconic status. It's well known to lots of British people. So I think if you haven't heard of Hypsilophodon, I would guess that you're younger than 30 and have never owned a British dinosaur book. But although we have lots of really awesome skull material that's been described in lots of great detail by Peter Galton, this material hasn't really been looked at recently. So we thought we would reinvestigate this using micro-CT. And I should just quickly mention that the brain case material that's available for Hypsilophodon allowed Peter to reconstruct what the endocast might look like. So I imagine this took a lot of time and effort using binocular microscope and camera lucida and tracing over the outlines that he could see and kind of inferring what the endocast might look like. So using CT scanning allows us to test this reconstruction. So this is the brain case computer model based on the CT scanning, and we were able to achieve 22 microns, which is pretty detailed. Here it is in place with some of the cranial material, so we can articulate the other bones that enclose the endocast, as you've already heard in Claire's talk. So eventually we're going to build a model of the entire skull for biomechanical analysis. I'm just going to talk about the endocast today. So here's the general anatomy. So there's lots of details such as the hypophyseal canal, which is not always found in dinosaur endocasts. And we also have evidence of arterial anatomy on the surface that gives us some confidence that this does actually tell us something about the brain shape in these animals. So a bit like mammals and modern birds, that the brain is closely opposed to the bones that's surrounding it. So if we compare this endocast computer model to Peter Galton's reconstructions, it's actually surprisingly similar. Peter did a really good job of getting the general anatomy and the proportions correct. And that's even more impressive from a dorsal perspective. Some of the differences may just simply be orientation. However, Peter wasn't able to reconstruct the bony labyrinth, which we are from our computer model because we can look inside the bones non-destructively. And this is just a color coding to represent the thickness of the endocast. So you should be able to see that these canals are fairly evenly thick, somewhere between 1 to about 1.25 millimeters. And although it's better preserved on the left, there are aspects of the cochlea that are well preserved on the right. So the general bone structure of Hypsilophodon is very similar to non-avian dinosaurs. There's some sort of fairly modest optic lobes, and there isn't that much cranial flexion. If we compare it to some more close relatives, again we can see that there's not a huge amount going on, but there are some interesting differences. And because Peter Goldson's reconstruction was shown to be fairly accurate, we can actually incorporate them into this scheme. So first of all, in the larger and more nested species, different parts of the brain start to become a lot more obvious. So this is from Stefan's paper. You can see that the cerebral hemispheres are clearer in these taxa. Now, interestingly, in many of these animals, there's this bulge coming out the side of the endocast. This represents the floccular fossa, but in Thescelosaurus, it's almost absent, which is an interesting feature. And if we look at the orientation of the horizontal semicircular canal and compare it to the orientation of the cranial nerves that are coming out the side of the brain case, you can see this difference here between Hypsilophodon and Discolotosaurus, where they're more parallel. However, this character seems to vary ontogenetically in Discolotosaurus. So Hypsilophodon and a lot of the other ornithischians seem to more closely relate compared to the juvenile Discolotosaurus. So what about, what can we interpret in terms of lifestyle and activity? So I mentioned the floccular fossa, which is present in most of these animals, but seems to be small in Thescelosaurus. So historically, this feature has been used to make quite speculative interpretations about activity. So it contains the part of the brain, the flocculus, which is involved in integrating information about the position of the head and helping to keep a steady gaze. And all kinds of interesting but horrible experiments have been done on pigeons to back up this. So people have suggested that having a large floccular fossa could support a flying lifestyle. However, we've since found that some cursorial animals have this feature. People have also suggested it might reflect bipedality, but we've since found animals that are quadrupedal that have it. And there's been a recent study where people divided birds up according to their mode of flight and their lifestyle, and it was very hard for them to find any significant correlations between simply the size of this structure and those things. So perhaps because of its not telling us about the internal structure of the brain, and there's also going to be other things going on within this space, such as blood capillaries and things like that, that maybe it's still a bit hard to use this directly. But one significant thing that did pop out of the modern birds is that diurnal birds seem to have a larger floccular fossa than nocturnal ones. So you've already heard about the head posture inferences you can make from the orientation of the horizontal semicircular canal. So that's running on here. And so for Hypsilophodon, there'd be about 7-degree difference from the tooth row. So fairly vanilla, but we need vanilla animals to give us an average so we can talk about these extremes such as Nigerosaurus. And I'll just point out this is alert head posture. It's not necessarily habitual or average head posture. So we have a bony labyrinth in Hypsilophodon, which might be able to tell us something about its hearing. So in birds, we know that the best frequency that an animal can hear is related to the basal papilla length, which is enclosed within the bony labyrinth. And it has an osteological correlate. So here's the labyrinth, and the basal papilla would be inside this cochlear duct here. So if we measure this metric, we can get an idea of how large the basal papilla is. And a few years ago now, Stig Walsh and Paul Barrett tested this with a bunch of living animals. What they found is you have living reptiles at this end of the spectrum whereas birds up here, so birds generally have able to have a mean range of, their hearing frequencies are higher, their mean hearing frequency is higher. And they plotted on some fossil bird taxa and found that they were closer to the modern birds rather than the reptiles, so higher frequencies. And we can plot on some dinosaurs here based on their cochlear ducts. And what we find generally is the larger dinosaurs have lower hearing frequencies. And Discolotosaurus is among some of the birds. And if we plot on here Hypsilophodon, it's not as low as some of these larger sauropods and ornithischians, but it's lower than Discolotosaurus. And there's a similar relationship with hearing range. Put these on again. We have the same kind of order, but essentially it's suggesting that Hypsilophodon had a range that was comparable to some non-avian reptiles such as crocodilians. And just for some more context, best frequency for birds is correlated with body mass. And the basal papilla length that's important for this is related to body mass. And if we plot on the dinosaurs, we can see that they spread out somewhat, but they do seem to follow this relationship. And Hypsilophodon, as a small dinosaur, fits amongst this as well. So in conclusion, Goldson's restorations are surprisingly accurate, which allow us to compare among ornithischians. The endocast of Hypsilophodon generally resembles that of other non-avian dinosaurs. The alert posture is 7 degrees from horizontal, and the floccular fossa is large, but it's unclear what this might actually mean for lifestyle. And we're able to calculate or make an estimate of the best frequency of hearing and also the hearing range for Hypsilophodon, and it's similar to non-avian reptiles today. So I'd just like to thank Mark Graham in particular, who helped prep some of the material before it was CT scanned, and also my co-authors, Paul Barrett, Laura, and David Button. And thanks Sandra and Susie for access, and also discussion with Claire and Emily, and you for listening.